Now, risk management is getting very important in the industry, and because of that, the CISSP exam is covering risk management more than it used to. It even changed the name of this domain, added risk management to the name. So we're really going to go into different parts of risk management because not only are you going to get tested on it, but it's something that people don't fully understand how to do. And it's not vulnerability testing. Vulnerability testing just means you could find the holes. It's easy to do that, and then you associate them with threats, and then you've got to calculate the risks. And so we have to look at the people, process, technology. We've got to look at all of them, and how data is stored, how it's moved. We've got a lot of things that we need to understand. Why is risk management difficult? Why would it be hard to actually carry out? Risk management is difficult because first off, you're trying to read the future. What bad things are going to happen, or what could happen, and how much is it going to cost us? So you're trying to look at the future and understand what can come down the pipe and hurt us. But you also have to look at so many different variables. Like I've been saying, there's administrative, technical, physical controls, there's operation, tactical. Several companies who have bought a risk management tool because it was very impressive. It had all these formulas and it had all these calculations, and it wasn't right for them. It has to be right for your environment, qualitative or quantitative, and it has to make sense. There are tools out there right now that I think are just for show. They don't actually provide any value. So on a personal note, this isn't CISSP oriented, before you buy a tool, really investigate, because this is important. You're actually determining the risk level of the organization and the amount of money that you have to spend to reduce this risk. So this is pretty critical. Now, I talked a little bit about the acceptable risk level of a company. And acceptable risk level, what does that mean? Well, every company has a different risk appetite. That means how much risk they're willing to take on. Now, when we talk about risk appetite, that usually is meaning in the business world. Businesses that have a high risk appetite means that they're going to take on risks. They're going to be on the bleeding edge. They're going to not be conservative. In security, we usually don't use the risk appetite as much as an acceptable risk level. And that's where how we know what is enough security, because an acceptable risk level has to be set. But how do you know, how do you define that? Who comes up with the acceptable risk level? Well, we talked about the drivers that go into setting up a security program, which are the legal issues, regulatory issues, threat profile, all of these things, and the business drivers. So those things are going to help determine the type of risk that a company can take on, and management actually has to set it. Management sets the acceptable risk level, not the team. They can bring this information to management and help management set it, but management needs to make set the line. And that's how we know we can accept risks up to here and not over. And this is where we get what's enough security. So, but it's very abstract. So where is this actually documented? The acceptable risk level. Is that written in some document somewhere with that label? No, it's not. You should set that and then develop your policies. Your policies should reflect your acceptable risk levels, and then your other things under the policies just get more granular that will indicate how you're going to stay under or within that acceptable risk level. So every company has a different acceptable risk level. A grocery store compared to the NSA, huge difference. And that's going to be determined on their threat profile. What type of enemies do you have? How motivated are they? What type of assets are you protecting? So somebody needs to be involved with helping management understand the security risk level that a company is under. Again, I work with companies that they don't know what this term really means, they don't know how to set it, and they don't know what is enough security, so they end up spending too much money or not enough money and don't get the right countermeasures. But you won't, because you're going to learn what needs to be put in place. Now, one thing the team is also going to have to do is determine how are they going to collect the data. And this, like I said, is the most time-consuming part of risk management, because you have to collect all this data, which is called an assessment, and then you have to do an analysis on it. So you get the schematics of the network. You get information on the type of data, where the data is, the type of security components that are in place. And then you have to look at some of the business issues that can be affected by security. So how are we going to get it? And a lot of it's through surveys. You can interview people who would know specifically about security information. You do vulnerability tests, you do penetration tests. You do this and you get this whole big glob of data. And then you have to separate it out and know what it actually means and what to do with it. So, a big thing is, what are we protecting? What are we trying to protect? You have to identify the assets you're going to protect, otherwise you don't know where to start from. And as I said before, within corporations and even the government sector, the main asset that we're protecting today is data, because our financial information is digital. All of our information is basically digital. Social security numbers, bank accounts, all of this. But that's not all that has to be protected. So that's the first thing we have to list, is what assets are we going to have to protect, and determine what type of risk level that they're at. Now, I said that we have to identify the assets that are to be protected under our risk management. We talked about what a vulnerability is, which is a weakness or a lack of a safeguard. Now, safeguard, control, countermeasure, those are all the same thing. I don't know why we don't just use one word, but a safeguard, control, countermeasure, all the same thing. So a vulnerability is a lack of a countermeasure or a weakness. And in the assets that we're protecting, we've got to look, what are the vulnerabilities? What are the holes? What are the things that somebody can exploit? Then we need to identify the threats. Remember that you don't care about a vulnerability unless there's a threat that can exploit it. Now, the thing that actually would exploit a vulnerability is called a threat agent. So the threat is that somebody's going to find a vulnerability and exploit it. What actually does the act, what exploits the vulnerability, is a threat agent. So we need to go through and look at all the vulnerabilities, whether it has to do with physical security, malicious code, employees sabotage. That's a big thing within itself. Now, I talked about we have to determine what methodology we're going to use. Now, there's different frameworks that we'll look at. There's Octave, and there's NIST has best practices on doing risk management. But the big question is, are we going to do it qualitative or quantitative? And the answer usually is, what does management want? Management would love to have things in numbers and in monetary values, because that's what they speak, and that's what they work in, spreadsheets and how much things are going to cost. Now, at one time, probably 3 years ago, I was I was a big advocate for quantitative. It has to be quantitative because it's business. It has to be monetary because that's what business wants. But doing a purely quantitative analysis is very difficult. It's very time. Everybody else works for that manager. If you ask that group, what are the problems in the company, or what are we not doing right, they're probably going to say whatever that manager wants them to say. They'll be intimidated. So to get honest, real information, it's very common to use the Delphi method, which means that you collect information anonymously because you don't really care who said what, you just need the information. So Delphi is a qualitative process, and you're collecting it from people anonymously so it could be honest, it could be direct and more useful. Now qualitative, again, I said it's based on ratings, and it's up to the group on the types of ratings you're going to use. It could be 1 through 10, A through F, high, medium, or low. That would be qualitative. And this is a common example. This is similar to what we saw before of actually using the squares, indicating what's a high risk, low risk. This is showing you a methodology. It's a formal methodology that has been developed in New Zealand, and it's commonly used in large corporations, and it's used for business issues, not just security risk issues. And so if you're looking for a formal risk methodology thing to follow, this is just showing you like the end product. But this is an example of one of the methodologies that are out there. So there's a different approach other than qualitative, which is quantitative. And like I said, this is monetary values, you use percentages. And we're going to step through how that actually works and some of the formulas that are commonly used in the industry. So what's the first thing to actually calculate is a single loss expectancy, the SLE value. And the formula to come up with that is the asset value times the exposure factor. Now, we've talked about the asset value. Remember, it's not just what we paid for it. It was all the other things, how much it costs to replace, what would our adversaries do with it, what are our liabilities if this asset gets compromised. So we cover the asset value. Now we multiply that times the exposure factor. The exposure factor is the percentage of damage we think will take place if this vulnerability is exploited. Because what we're doing is we're looking at one asset and one threat and calculating how much this could potentially cost the company. So on this asset, if this vulnerability was exploited, what would that cost? That's a single loss expectancy. That's just one thing. So, and it's important that you know not only these formulas, but you may be given a simple example where you have to actually do the calculations yourself. Now, what we need to look at also is how often do we think that this would take place? And remember what I said that the risk definition is. It's the business impact and the probability. What is the probability of something of this taking place? And in quantitative approaches, we call that the annual rate of occurrence. Within a 12-month period, how often do we think that's going to happen? So ARO is the frequency. How often do we think that's going to take place? Now the ARO is an annual metric. So if we think it's going to take place one time in a year, the ARO is 1.0. If we think it's going to take place once in 10 years, then it's 0.1, etc. So the ARO is the frequency. It's based on annual, 12 months. If we think it's going to take place 3 times in a year, what would that be? The ARO would be 3. So now we need to put all this together. The single loss expectancy, again, and I'm going to repeat this because I've taught it a lot, and I know that people miss what we're actually doing. Unfortunately, what a lot of people do is they memorize this for the exam. They don't understand how it really works in the real world. They get their CISSP, but they don't know how to use this information. So SLE means that we have one asset, and we think that if something bad happens, let's say a tornado, this percentage of that asset would be affected. That's the SLE. Now we need to look at, well, what's the probability? How often do we determine the budget that's needed for the security program overall? It's going to tell us, it's a roadmap. This is what we have to do first. This is the potential loss we can go through. This is the potential, or this is the budget that we actually need. That's why we do the ALE. It's not a specific value. So, and what I mean by that is, it's not going to be like you're absolutely going to lose this specific amount of information. It's a guesstimation because you're looking into the future. So this is potentially how much we can lose. So again, remember I said the definitions between the different concepts within security are important. You have to identify the vulnerabilities. You identify if they have any threats that can exploit them. You calculate the risks, either based on qualitative or quantitative, and that lets you categorize the risk based on importance, on what you need to put money towards first. So let's go through a quick calculation. If we have an e-commerce site and we have a value of $300,000 and we think that there's going to be 40% damage, let's say if somebody hacked in or a virus or something. So we'll just say hacker because that's what most people are interested in. So we have our e-commerce sites worth $300,000, and we estimate that if this exploit happens, that it's going to cause 40% damage. So the first thing we have to calculate is the SLE. So it's $300,000 multiplied by the exposure factor. So that would be 0.4 because it's 40%. The SLE is $120,000. That's for one time. If it happens one time, we could potentially lose that much amount of money, or that's how much we have to spend to recover. But of course, threats can happen more than once, so we have to figure out the probability. That's where the ARO comes in. We have the SLE, we multiply it times the ARO, which is how often we think it's going to take place. And if we think it's going to take place once, then it's 1.0, and our ALE is $120,000. So what this means is, for this specific vulnerability, we're not going to spend over $120,000 to protect against it. We're not going to spend $300,000 because we don't even have that potential loss. Again, that's how it helps us set our budget for the type of controls that we need to put in place. So you walk through an example yourself. If we have a facility that's worth $650,000, and if a tornado comes through, is $78,000. After we put the countermeasure in place, the new ALE is $20,000. The actual cost of the countermeasure is $60,000. Is this the right decision? Is this the right countermeasure for us? The answer is no, because we'd be in the negative. In our cost-benefit analysis, we would be spending more for the countermeasure than we could potentially lose. So this is a very good exercise to go through. Even if companies don't do the exact numbers, even if you don't use this exact formula, what's really good is that you understand the value of an asset, all that goes into that, and that you understand when you buy a countermeasure, it's not just how much you're going to pay for it. Those concepts are very important. Now, if you put them in a formula, great, and for the CISSP exam, you're going to need to know the formulas. But a lot of this stuff is very good, even if you understand it conceptually, how to put it in place in your environment. So again, a lot of companies just put in the countermeasures that they think they've heard about, or it's the new thing, or they're not educated or informed decisions. A lot of purchasing is not informed decisions. And again, that's not because people are stupid. It's just that it's hard to know all of this stuff. This is an immature market, and we're all learning. Now, with the control that we're going to put in place for the countermeasure, there's several things that we need to look at, not just how much is it going to cost, but there's a whole list of things that we also need to look at. Is it going to default to least privilege? Is it flexible? Does it provide uniform protection? Is it modular in nature? Modular is a big deal now in the industry, that you can put it in, update it if you need to, and not affect all the systems around it. Does it require human intervention? Means do people have to do something, which is always a bad thing. Anytime people have to be involved, that's when mistakes happen. Auditing is a big thing that needs to be in place. Since we're under regulations, it's become even more important. So does this countermeasure, does it have auditing functionality? Is it usable? Has it been tested? Can we test it? And that's a big, a lot of companies should do some type of bake-offs or test products before they put it in place. Some companies are afraid to ask vendors to get a copy of the product, but they should be able to give you a copy. You put it in the lab and have go through tests to make sure that it's not going to negatively affect your systems or your business functionality. So quantitative analysis, what's the benefit of that? Well, we're able to give management the report in what they want, which is in monetary values, it's in percentages, it's scientific, it's objective. So these are the benefits of a quantitative analysis. What are the disadvantages of this? There's an amazing amount of information or data that you have to gather to properly carry out a quantitative analysis. For example, there are certain tools that are just quantitative, and they'll want you to figure out what is the confidentiality cost for an asset, integrity cost, availability cost. There's all of these things that you have to figure out or collect. It's a lot of information, very detail-oriented. It's hard to carry out manually because there's so much information and because mathematics are involved. That's usually done through tools. It's not very flexible, and there's no real standard of exactly how it should be done. So quantitative, there's good and bad about it, but the main thing you need to know for CISSP is what is it, what are the formulas, and what does formulas mean. Now qualitative, what's great about that? Well, you're assigning values. You don't have to gather all this information and do all this mathematical work. You're assigning some type of ratings, high, medium, or low. That's a lot easier. It's much more flexible, and you don't have to go through as much work, really. You have to gather the data, but you don't have to go through all the work that you do with quantitative, with all the calculations and such. So what's the disadvantages of qualitative? It's subjective because it's a gut feeling, or you may need another control to be able to reduce the risk. Now, one thing that's not commonly done in this risk program approach is an uncertainty analysis. What an uncertainty analysis is how much confidence do you have in the data that you put into the formulas or the data that you collect? Because some of the data you can know for a fact based on maybe historical events. Maybe you've collected metrics over 3 years and you have confidence in that type of data. Maybe you're actually getting data that you have nothing to base on. It's going on a gut feel. So an uncertainty analysis has to do with assigning the amount of trust or in the information that you're actually using. Because when you take this information, you go to management, they need to understand that you're not going to necessarily lose this much amount of money if you're doing quantitative. It's a guess. We're doing the best that we can on understanding our potential risks that we could run into. Now, there's 4 ways of dealing with risk, and this is not up to the group who just did the analysis. How it goes is you get a team, you identify the assets, you identify the vulnerabilities and threats, you calculate the risks, you come up with potential solutions, and then you hand it over to management. You give them the information. These are potential risks. It's up to them to determine what to do with the risk. It's their responsibility, nobody else's, because they're ultimately liable. So there's 4 ways of dealing with risk: mitigation, transfer, acceptance, and avoidance. A lot of companies don't either understand that those 4 ways of dealing is available, or they don't use it. Most of them don't understand. So a lot of times I've seen many companies have have a large consulting company come in and do a big risk analysis and all these pretty pictures and pie charts and everything, and then they do nothing with it because they don't know what to do with it. So you need to know what to actually do with the data you just collected. What do you do with this risk? So if you're going to you put a control in place, that means you're going to mitigate. You're going to reduce your risk. Put a control in place, you mitigate. Now you can actually transfer your risk, which means like buying insurance, which means that this risk is too big to sit on our shoulders. It's too much for us to take on. So there is cyber insurance. There's different types of insurance that deals with anything that could take place and that can negatively affect your revenue. So that's one way, is transferring the risk. Another way is acceptance. You accept the risk. You know about it, you accept it. And really, the acceptance of the risk is when the countermeasure costs more than your potential loss. So that's when you usually just say, okay, we understand the risk and we'll accept it. Now, another way is avoidance. And what avoidance means is you're going to stop whatever is causing the risk. So, for example, if the team has come up with a risk that you're allowing your users to use instant messaging and it's going through your firewall, well, instant messaging is a way to pass viruses and bad stuff just like any other protocol. So you can choose to accept it because maybe there's a business case that you actually need it. You can mitigate it, meaning that you still allow your users to use it, but maybe you set up your own internal instant messaging server and have it controlled. Or you avoid it. You say there's no business use for using instant messaging, so it's not allowed. So avoidance just means you get rid of what actually is causing the risk. Now, risk acceptance. This, I think, is huge in the industry because most organizations are accepting risk, or they've delegated who's going to accept the risk or deal with the risk, and people just accept it. Like when I said that you need to delegate who's responsible for risk, and companies that have the business unit managers or the department heads that are responsible for the risk within their department, what I've seen is a lot of times that department head or that business manager doesn't understand or doesn't have the time or has enough other things to do, and they just accept the risk and they don't understand what they're accepting. So when you accept risk, it needs to be based on cost, where we did the cost benefit analysis with the control. Pain means that if we allowed this risk to exist, how is it going to hurt us? How is it going to affect us? And visibility, reputation. If we just accept this risk and our customers find out about it, how's that going to hit, how is that going to affect our reputation? And it shouldn't be a surprise decision. You should have a very calculated or a process that you're going through, which is what we're talking about. We're talking about building a whole security risk management program, and you're not just winging it. So this is what we started with, and this is what we'll end with in risk management, where we have to have a team. We develop a scope of what we're to be protecting. We come up with our method, which is, are we using quantitative or qualitative? We identify the tools that we're going to use. The tools are beneficial because they'll reduce the amount of work we have to do. We have to understand the acceptable risk level. What's enough security? Then we collect the information. We identify the assets. We assign values to those assets. We identify the vulnerabilities and threats. We calculate the risks. We do cost-benefit analysis and an uncertainty analysis. And then we hand it over to management. And management decides, are we going to mitigate, transfer, accept, or avoid? And so this is not only good for the exam, this is a very good roadmap to use in a corporation or organization that's trying to set up a risk program.